First, a story. When I was researching the book, I went to the Roper River because the Roper River had a depot right on the shores of it, which was very important. And I was wandering around the old police station there, which is long gone and burnt down, and there's a few remnants. And this couple was walking around as well. And I got talking to this bloke named Barry Marshall, and I said, well, what are you doing here? And he said, I'm just tracing the journeys made by my great-great-uncle. And I said, what was his name? And he said, Nucky. And I said, Richard Randall Nucky. I've just written a chapter about him. And turns out that he was following him. And Richard Randall Nucky is very important in South Australian history as well. But it occurs to me that there may well be a lot of other descendants here, because I'm getting a list of them, of various people on the Overland Telegraph line. And I'd just like you to wave at me. Give me a hearing impaired applause if you're a descendant. Wow, look at that. That's almost worth a photograph in itself, people doing that. Yes, this has been a bit of a passion of mine for the last year or so. It's a lot of kilometres between here and Darwin. If you've been up there, you know. But this is my first time ever to Adelaide, so I feel as though I'm in an exalted company. I've missed out, you're right, yes. Now, we're talking about building the Overland Telegraph line. People describe it as the greatest engineering challenge. And a mate of mine in Darwin was the engineer who built the new government house there in the 90s. And I said to him, why is it an engineering challenge when all it is sticking a pole in the ground and an insulator on top and stringing a wire in it? What's so challenging about that? And he just shook his head sadly and said, you don't understand. He said, it's the engineering part of which was difficult was the logistics, of course. Charles Todd and his team were the first white people to cross the country after John McDowell Stuart. Nobody really knew what was there. They followed Stuart's path quite often very closely. Some of the early surveyors talk about following Stuart's horse tracks, the pad through the hill, which was 10 years old, but it was still there. No other horses had ever been up there, so it had to be Stuart's, and he had about 70 horses, so it would have left quite a mark. So we had 2,839 kilometres from Port Augusta to Darwin. You often hear about 3,100, but that's taking it from Adelaide. The OTL actually ran from Port Augusta because the line from Adelaide to Port Augusta was already in, so it was just joined onto that. There were about 500 people, 460 or more people that he had to employ. He needed horses, bullocks, camels, to add to that sheep to eat and cattle to eat, drays, carts, ships to go around the coast, and wire, insulators, tools and food for his men. A lot of that was food on the hoof or the cloven hoof. First thing that Todd did was divide the country into three, southern section, central section and northern section, and then he put out tenders for it. The southern section was the easiest really because most of this country was already known up to about Mount Margaret, which is Unadada area across those plains. And once you experience a kilometre of that country, you've experienced it all. I think it's very similar, right? Hundreds of kilometres, absolutely stunning. And the central section, Todd took control of himself and divided it into 5 and employed government surveyors, many of whom had already worked on settling at Darwin the year before. And that's, as an aside, we're talking about settling in Port Darwin. The new governor, called the government resident in those days, was a guy called Douglas, Bloomfield Douglas, and he arrived in June on the Gulnare at the same day as the ship arrived with the orders for him to start the Overland Telegraph line. Same day, it was that early on in the history of Port Darwin. People had only been living there for about 6 months after the survey had finished. The northern section and southern section were therefore put out to tender. The southern section was taken out by Bagot, and the northern section by people called Dalwood and Derwent. And they did the first 300 odd Ks before they were summarily sacked by the government worker who was a failed tenderer himself. So all sorts of skullduggery went on there, I think. These are the tenders. Now the point about that was Joseph Darwin didn't last very long. Robert Patterson took over after the wet season. People living down here really got no concept of what a northern wet season is like, and the troubles they had to get through the mud, where horses would get bogged, and so bogged they had to leave them in the mud and couldn't get them out. They couldn't move across much of the land at all in the wet season, and people started to get malaria and scurvy because they weren't eating properly. So Darwin were sacked because of that, so it wasn't really their fault. They got compensated eventually. But Robert Patterson came in and he did the last section, including the depot on the river, Rover River. Now, the point of this is, if you look at the difference in dates, I haven't got my glasses on, 27th to the August 16, 22nd is it? 27th? 22nd of July to August the 16th. That was the time they had for putting in the tenders. It just drives home the point that they didn't have much time. You've got 2 weeks to tender to run a line for 500 kilometres. Do it or don't. Recruitment. A lot of people. This is just one list that came into the newspaper, and I've added their professions beside them, but not much point showing that at a distance. But these are some of the guys that were employed. This is Derwin's party, and if you zoom in, they look like a bunch of Mexican bandidos to me. But see, they're all standing there. They've got interesting tools. This guy's probably a farrier. They've got horse things. I like this photograph. There's lots in it. This back here, as you might expect, roll after roll after roll of wire, and other equipment they had there, water tanks, bits and pieces. Now, that didn't work. Didn't do anything then. Here's another list. Just of people. This is out of a newspaper on July 1871. I'm just picking 3 of those people out of that list to talk about. Robert Patterson, Alfred Pybus and William Crowder. Patterson appears in this picture, which was taken on the March 11th. This picture in singular, because even though there are 2 of them, they're actually the same picture, same day, same time, with a quick change of clothes. It was obviously a very important picture for them. It's the one that got into the London Illustrated News and was still being shown around the world. You'll notice John Little on the left. He was the head of the Telegraph and Post office in Darwin, and he became the senior territory public servant for about 34 years. He was there for a long time. Robert Patterson, who was the leader of the construction party, he was a railway engineer initially. He ended up building a lot of railways in Tasmania until he fell over dead in a board meeting one day of a cerebral hemorrhage. Charles Todd, you know about, look, the interesting thing, Charles Todd changes his shirt. Patterson changes his hat. On the right-hand photograph, he's wearing what he called his smoker's cap. And we know he called it a smoker's cap because he mentioned he wore it in his diary one day and went out on a cloudy morning and the sun came out and he got really badly sunburnt. He should have been wearing his boater, which he's got on the left-hand picture there, which gave him a bit of sun protection. I have a boater to wear at Frews Ponds in a few weeks' time. That boaters these days, you might have noticed, have been hijacked by private girls' schools, and they're pretty hard to get my size because most girls don't have giant heads. But I've got one on the internet. The other guy there is Alexander Mitchell, who was a surveyor. He was a surveyor in 1869 as well in Darwin. Mitchell Street in Darwin is named after him, and there's a lot of things named after him. A little note there saying Little's 2-tone shoes. You see in the picture there, lovely 2-tone shoes. And his pith helmet, you'll see his pith helmet again later. It's a very odd shaped one. I've never seen anything else like it, but it'll come up. There it is there, look at that. Little's the third there. It looks like some sort of flying saucer, spaceship or something. It's very odd. This is photographed on the same day. They're almost wearing the same clothes. Patterson's put his jacket on. This is in February. If you've been up to the top end in February, you don't want to wear a jacket for very long. So it must have been a very brief sort of dress up for it. The guy on the right there, I think, is Captain Pearce. He's wearing a jacket as well. Now, this photograph, I'll come back to that. This is Alfred Pybus. Now, this is at Powell's Creek Telegraph Station. He's buried there. He was a lineman for 29 years, and he put, in 1898, he ran the copper wire through that section of the line as well. So he was a very loyal member, but he was there right at the very beginning, employed when that call came out in the Adelaide papers. But he's lying out there. I put this on a Facebook page the other day saying, wouldn't it be nice to be buried out somewhere there where nobody ever goes and you're there forever all by yourself? I find that rather attractive, but other people said, oh, a waste of space. And William Crowder. Now, Crowder was a 17-year-old lad. He was employed as a cadet, which means he wasn't one of the men. He was in between the officers and the men. He would sort of be a servant for the men quite often. He did a lot of the drawings and paperwork for the surveyors and people as well. Now, he said that he was in all the photographs taken on the 11th of March that year in his diary. And so I got all the photographs and trying to find one young man, a 17-year-old, and there are only 2 or 3 of them in the whole crowd, who was in all the photographs, and this is the guy who appears. And plus he's with the officers, so I think that's William Crowder. Now, when he left Adelaide, they sailed around to Melbourne. He was seasick all the way, and then he had 3 days to wait in Melbourne for the next ship around to Roper River. And if you're 17, think about this. What would you do in 3 days in Melbourne if you were travelling there these days? He went to the museums, 2 Shakespeare plays and the opera, and he records it all on his things. Now, how many 17-year-olds will do that these days? Okay, I haven't heard any ding. How much long have I got?
3 minutes for the first bell and another 5 minutes for the second.
Okay, good. We'll get there. One more of the note from that picture. Have a look at this. That little red circle there, can you see that? Well, that's not all you're going to get. You're going to get an enlargement of her, a woman. Who is that woman? And it turns out that it's Mrs. Elizabeth Sweet, who is the wife of the photographer. So I presume that man beside her is not her husband, because he would be taking that photo. But she is an interesting, the only woman there probably, came up on the ship, talks about it. I have to read this, I've got my glasses on. Mrs. Sweet arrived on the Omeo on 27th of January. Captain Sweet came downriver to pilot the large ship back to the depot. This is what she said. As the boat came alongside, a poor, dilapidated man came over the side, unshaved, very little clothes on, a sock on one foot, nothing on the other, but this was my husband, and I could not help feeling thankful he had not met poor Reed's fate. And so she wrote that. Now, I thought I'd look into her, could have been the only woman there. And poor Reed's fate, who was Reed? Now, Reed was a crew member on Captain Sweet's ship, the Gulnare, the year before. I'll come back to him because I've got this bit here about the only other reference I could find for Mrs. Sweet was in 1905 when, after the captain had died, he was a great photographer. A lot of the photographs around Adelaide in those days were taken by him. She was a testimonial on this safe rheumatic cure bottle. It affords me great pleasure to testify to the great and lasting benefit I derived from taking Warner's safe cure after suffering for many years from constitutional breakdown and nervous prostration, brought on by my mental worry and family troubles. I've been the mother of 14 children and lost my husband, so was compelled to support my family by my own unaided efforts. And the only way she could do that was drink their stuff. So. Now, who was Paul Reed? His name was William Reed, and he's now #1 in the Book of the Dead in the Darwin Archives, the Northern Territory. He died in December 1870, and was marked in the 1871 Book of the Dead when they started it. And you have a look at the cause of death, it says drowning. He was dragged overboard from a boat by an alligator. Now, as a Territorian, I'm very proud of that. We like our crocodiles. And apparently he was a tall man, and he went to sleep in the cutter for the Gulnare up the Wilton River with a leg hanging over the side. And that was just too tempting for a poor alligator. It's probably still there too, you know. It could be always 150 years later. Anyway, he makes #1. Now, into transport and equipment. They had these drays, everything was very slow. They had cattle, bullock wagons that needed 20 or 10 or 20, depending on the weight pulling on. They pushed up sheep, several thousand sheep were pushed up. They lost half of them to poison plants. And one of the brothers pushing up was speared and he died, so they paid the final price. And they introduced camels and Afghan cameleers from Beltana station, and they started travelling up there. Canned food was very important. In some of my early books, they didn't have canned food, so people starved ridiculously easy in country which was full of food. But a lot of these cans, which you find up at Yam Creek, the Shackle Telegraph Station, you can still see lead solder around the top of them, the old ones. So they're quite interesting to look at. Rubbish is everywhere. All these sites are full of rubbish. It's incredible. They had to do timber poles. I'll cut through this a bit fast. This is Todd's words about his orders for timber poles. They had to be so wide, so high, and they needed a charring on the base. They needed to be and 20 to the mile, which is the title of the book because of that. They also needed what I call a ferrule. I've heard other people call it a ferrule, but to me that's a ferrule because it's spelt ferrule. That's a bit of metal they wrap around. I saw this the other day on a section of line just south of Alice Springs. It's in the sand and still there. There's no sign of the wood, but they replaced it with Oppenheimer poles, which are metal and often they're still there. Oppenheimer was a German guy who was producing these poles in Manchester, and they came out in 3 bits and they were telescopic and they were screwed together. And it's not unsure whether they turned up already screwed together or they did them there. I think the former, I think they were already set up and just put on drays and taken up. Siemens Brother poles came in a bit later. They were solid poles that weren't telescopic, but they had this huge base area there, which you can see on the left-hand picture. And in some places where this is not far from Alice Springs, every second pole is a Siemens, and Oppenheimer Siemens. So they might have set up it as 10 to the mile with a wooden pole in between and replaced them as they went on. They were first across the country, so they needed explorers. And this is John Ross. You can see J. Ross there just in there. J. Ross. This is Chambers Pillar. He was the first white man to climb it, and he carved his name on it with his team. Chambers Pillar was named after James Chambers by John McDowell Stewart 10 years before, but he didn't climb it. So he left his graffiti. Now, going up there to see it, you think, well, why is graffiti so important? Because if you do it nowadays, it's certainly not. And so the argument comes in, when does graffiti become historically interesting? How long does it take? The maps are quite detailed for those days. This is an 1873 map, annotated by one of the guys that used it. It's in the South Australian Library. You can zero in on sections of it. There's Chambers Pillar down the bottom, which is off to the left of the west of the line, and then it goes through Lawrence Gorge and turns around and into McDonnell Ranges. So you can still follow them. The maps are quite interesting to look at. I've got about 1 minute left for a very quick guided tour of the OTL across Australia. OTT. If you heard this is what Mac was using the other day. I'd never heard it. This is the new buzzword, guys. The OTT is the Overland Telegraph Track, which is going to become the new tourist destination. Everybody's going to want to do it. I think that's wonderful. You go through the Flinders Ranges. They have a number of sites there where there are still poles. And that house on the right is Beltana Station, now privately owned and still lived in, at least as a weekender, and in very good condition. Outback South Australia, you've got the Angle Pole near Oodnadatta, Maree Hotel, which is 1885, I think, or 84. The old Gulnare Railway and their bridges. And that's Strangways Station there. The collapsed building site is the actual telegraph station. On the left, a lot hardier, is a water tank. It looks like a sort of French church. Outback Northern Territory, if you're going to do the Overland Telegraph Track, you go through Devil's Marbles, you go through various abandoned telegraph stations. That was badly put. This is South Australia again. That's the peak. Oh, quick, better go. Remote Northern Territory. You get to see the lines, remnant lines through the Simpson Desert, very nice to see. Attack Creek, lots of stories there. This is Roper River, Leichhardt's Crossing, and the OTL joining pole near Darwin, Daly Waters, Yam Creek, Darwin Harbour, where the cable came in like that. And the film we're doing, we've got funding to do most of this film as far as the Northern Territory goes. We're still short of funding to film the section of the story in South Australia. So if anybody knows of any good corporate sponsor, come and see me afterwards because we need the money. Okay, thank you very much.